Good morning, grade sixes, and welcome to Natural Science. This is the very first time that I'm going to be teaching you. So, my name is Miss Kun, and I'm very excited to teach you science. I absolutely love science. I've been teaching it for years. It's one of my biggest passions, and I am honored to be able to be teaching you for the next couple of lessons. So, let's begin. What are we learning today? Today, we are going to be looking at solutions, and I'm going to be doing this lesson over, or this section over 2 lessons. So today we're going to be focusing on part 1. Right. So let's first look at what we're going to be doing today. So our objectives today is we're going to look at what exactly is a solution. We're going to be looking at what is a solute and a solvent. So there's lots of new words that you're going to be learning today. Thirdly, we're going to be looking at soluble and insoluble substances. And lastly, we're going to end off with a little experiment that I'm going to do with you to determine which substances are going to be soluble or insoluble. So that is what we are going to be doing today. So I don't know about you, but I'm very excited. Before I carry on, I just want you to know that I talk science. And so throughout this lesson, I'm going to continually use the new terms that we are going to use, and we're going to learn together. And I'm going to continually talk about it so that the more you talk, the more you start to understand, because the whole thing about science is that you have to talk science in order to understand and practice science. Right? Are you ready? Let's go. Okay. So the very first thing is, what is a solution? And I'm sure that a lot of you have heard the term before, what a solution actually is. So some of you, if you have never heard it before, a solution is when a solid dissolves in a liquid and it forms a special type of mixture called a solution. Now, solutions are usually substances, the solutes are usually solid and the solvent is usually the liquid. So for example, I do have some water over here, and later on I'm going to show you what's going to happen if I add, say, sugar to water and what happens to it. So if I have sugar, which some of you, I don't know if you can see, I'm busy pouring sugar on my hand. The sugar we will refer to as the solute, and the water in this instant will be known as a solvent. And together they make a solution, right? So remember, solute, solvent, solution. Okay, now specifically I'm going to start off with a solute, which is what I just showed you with the sugar. Now, the solute is always the substance in a solution that is present in the lesser or the smaller amount. So when you have a solute and a solvent, the substance that is always in the smaller quantity will always be known as the solute. If, for example, this was the other way around with the water and the sugar, if I had more sugar than water, then it would be a little bit different, right? But in this situation, the solute is always in the smaller amount, okay? The other thing about a solute is that in a solution, the solute is completely dissolved or mixed with a solvent. So later on in this lesson, we are going to look at soluble and insoluble substances, and I'm going to explain what that means. And we're going to look at solutes that are soluble and solutes that are insoluble, but we will come to that in a little bit. Okay, so now we've spoken about a solute. Now, just to end off, remember that when a solute is mixed in a solvent and it is soluble, you won't be able to see it anymore. We say it is invisible, but I'm going to specifically talk about where that solute goes a little bit later, because it doesn't just disappear. Right, moving on. So now we're going to look at a solvent specifically. So remember, if you have a look at the picture, the solute will be, for example, salt, sugar, and your solvent is your liquid in this case, let's say water. Together, they become your solution. Now, your solvent is always the substance that is in the greater amount. So later on, I'm going to show you two scenarios, and I'm going to give you the amount of each substance before they are mixed together. And I'm going to say to you, right, in this case, which substance would be classified as the solute and which substance will be classified as the solvent, because it is important to always differentiate between the two. So again, solute is the substance in the smaller quantity, and solvent is the substance in the greater quantity or the greater amount. Right. So now, here's the different situations as I was saying. So if we have a look, if I have 50 mils of Oros, which is a small amount, in a glass of water, and a glass, for those of you that should know, it is 250 mils. So in this situation, remember, Oros is a liquid and water is also a liquid. But when I mix the two together, we have a solution, delicious solution. So the Oros, being the smaller amount, only 50 mils, will be classified as the solute, and the water, which is 250 mils, will be classified as the solvent. Right, let's look at another example. If I have water in your cup of tea, so I've got my tea bag and I've got my water, the water is going to be the greater amount, so it's known as the solvent. Right. If I have a teaspoon of coffee in hot water, remember your coffee is going to be in a smaller amount. Remember, a teaspoon is very small. So your coffee will be known as your solute and your hot water will be your solvent. Right. I hope you got all of them right before I told you the answers. So well done, scientists. You are definitely on the right track. Remember your terminology: solute, solvent, solution. Okay, let's recap. Solute, the substance that is dissolved, example salt. Solvent is the liquid used to dissolve, the example water. And a solution is when a solute is dissolved in the solvent. So out of all the terminology in this lesson, these three are one of the most important. So continually talk about it. Whenever you're describing anything, I want you to say to yourself, right, the solute does this, the solvent does this, together solution. Remember, talk science all the time to familiarize yourself and to be comfortable and confident within the subject. Okay, now whenever we show a solution or represent a solution, we also represent it in the form of an equation. So in this situation, we say a solute plus a solvent equals a solution. And if I use salt as a solute for an example, we say salt plus a water solvent, because you have to specify what is the solvent. It can be any type of liquid, and remember, water is a type of liquid. So salt plus a water solvent is equal to a salt water solution. Got it? Right, you're doing great. Let's go. Now, this is quite an interesting question. What happens to salt when it dissolves in water? Earlier I said to you that the salt, when it dissolves in water and it forms a salt solution, we don't see it anymore. Now, it doesn't just disappear like magic, because science is very specific. And that's why I love science, because science is all around you and there's reasons and facts why things happen the way that they do. So specifically, what happens to the salt? There's no ways it disappears. I would love to perform magic, but this is science. So let's have a look. Okay, so in front of you, you can see we've got our teaspoon of salt and we've got water. The moment that we start to add salt in the water, the particles of your salt actually start to break up, and they then, as you can see with the picture, they then immerse themselves amongst the water molecules. Right, and what happens is that they're then mixed with the particles of the water. The salt has dissolved in the water and a solution has formed. So the salt particles are still there in the water, but because they're broken up and they're all mixed, you don't see it anymore. Right, remember salt, the solid, salt is a solid, and you know the properties of a solid is that the particles are so tightly packed to each other. And so when it is dissolved, or when it's dissolved in this solvent such as water, it then loosens it up and it spreads it out amongst the water, right? So again, our equation solute plus a solvent is equal to a solution. Okay, so here's just another picture to show you. In this situation, they're talking about sugar. If I put sugar in a solvent of water, you can see that the sugar molecule, it starts to break up and it evenly disperses throughout the solvent. Right, now the two words that you see before you are the words soluble and insoluble. Now these words from now on I will be using very often, or pretty much all the time, because these are scientific words to describe whether a solution or should I say to describe whether a solute is able to dissolve or whether it cannot dissolve at all. So think of it, it's like a synonym for the word dissolve, whether it can dissolve or it cannot dissolve. So that is what the word soluble and insoluble mean, right? So as I've just mentioned, it's whether the solute has the ability to dissolve. We call it it is soluble. And if a solute is not able to dissolve, cannot dissolve, we call it insoluble. Means it cannot dissolve. Insoluble. Okay, so soluble can, insoluble cannot. Right, moving on. Okay, so now we've reached the part of the lesson that I'm going to do a little experiment. I've got some substances in front of me, and I'm going to switch the camera now. So just having a look at the table, we are going to test whether sugar is soluble or insoluble in water, flour is soluble or insoluble, sand is soluble or insoluble, and then lastly vinegar, soluble or insoluble. Just to take note of the table, and remember in science when we talk about the rules of tables, every table has to have a heading. So as you can see, my heading table to show soluble or insoluble substances, that is underlined. Right, so now I'm just going to switch the view to the screen so you can see me in all my glory, and we are going to test now the different substances to see if they're soluble or if they're insoluble. Okay, so I am going to start off and show you that I've got my glass of water in front of you. And I'm going to start off with a teaspoon of sugar. So as you can see, I've got regular sugar from the kitchen. I'm going to put a teaspoon of sugar. I'm always going to make it level, so the quantity is going to be the same. I'm going to put a teaspoon of leveled sugar in my water. I'm going to give it a little bit of a stir so we can see what's happening. As I am stirring, you can see that my particles are, it's starting to get less and less. The amount of sugar is less and less. Now, an interesting situation has happened right now, and it's actually going to be what I'm going to be teaching you in our next lesson. So most of the sugar that I've put in my solvent, which is my water, has actually dissolved. However, because as you can see, however, for some of you that can see very closely, there's a little bit that is remaining at the bottom of my glass. Now, that's quite interesting because what we have here is that the amount of sugar that was added, or the amount of solute that was added to my solvent, started to dissolve, and eventually this solution became too heavy of sugar or too heavy of your solute, and we call that a saturated solution, where the sugar cannot dissolve anymore. Just to show you again, that is what is left, but we can safely say that our sugar is soluble. Right, the next substance that we have, again, I've got a clear glass of water. So I've got all my glasses of water, same glass, same amount, same quantity of solvent to keep it fair and accurate. So here is my glass of water. The second substance that I'm going to test is going to be sand. Now I just have some ordinary sand from the garden. Here is my teaspoon of sand. I'm going to, and my sand is my solute because it is in the smaller quantity. I'm going to mix my sand with my solvent, which is my water. Give it a little bit of a mix. It's made it quite dark. And if I look very closely at the solution, so if I spoon it out, and remember you can do this at home, so get some water, grab some sand from your garden and try it. Okay, if I have a look at the teaspoon and I look very carefully at the solution, I can still see grains of sand that are suspended in the solvent or in the solution. And so this sand is not dissolved. I can fully conclude that sand is insoluble. It cannot dissolve in water, and in this case being the solvent, right? Then the third substance that I'm going to show you today is I have got some flour. Let me get a teaspoon of flour. Here's some ordinary flour, so for those of you that like to bake like I do, we are going to test some flour. So I'm going to put a teaspoon of flour in some water. I'm going to give it a little bit of a stir. Now, as you can see here, again, it looks like it's dissolved. So some people would actually say, well, Miss Kuhn, I'm sure it's dissolved. But it actually hasn't. If you look very carefully, and remember, the biggest thing to do is to take your teaspoon, look carefully at your teaspoon and see what has happened. And you still see your little bits of flour and fine flour grains still suspended in the mixture, or in the solution, should I say. And so flour is insoluble. At the moment, it looks cloudy because it is suspended. It's almost like it hangs in the solution. But if you give it time, it eventually starts to sink, and it starts to sink to the bottom of your glass. So flour, we can say, is insoluble. The last thing that I want to, the last substance that I want to experiment with today is vinegar. So again, I have got my glass of water. I've got some ordinary grape vinegar from my kitchen. I'm going to put a teaspoon of grape vinegar on my spoon. There we go. Whenever I smell vinegar, it always reminds me of slop chips. So for those of you that love slop chips, that is what I'm craving right now. Okay, so I've got my vinegar. Remember, vinegar, yes, it is a liquid, but the vinegar in this situation is our solute. Solute, solvent. Mix the two together. Give it a bit of a mix. Can you see the vinegar in my water? Or in my solvent? No, you cannot. It has formed a solution. And vinegar, because I cannot see it anymore, we can safely say that vinegar is soluble in water. We can't see the vinegar anymore, and so our vinegar is soluble. Right, so just to conclude our experiment, vinegar is soluble. So yes, it is soluble. It can dissolve. Sugar, soluble, it can dissolve. Sand, insoluble, it did not dissolve. And then lastly, flour. Flour we saw was insoluble. Remember, it didn't dissolve. It looked very milky and cloudy, but it was because the particles were suspended in the solution, and so it didn't fully dissolve. Right, so it was insoluble. Okay. Right, I'm going to quickly change my screen and end off. And so I would like to just end off with you, grade sixes, and say to you all that just to recap some of the important words that we've learned today. Solute, remember, our solute, our solvent, together, the two mixed together create a solution. And with our solution, we then, in our solution, can see, is our solute soluble or is it insoluble? Right, those are the important words and terminology that we have learned today. I really hope that you have enjoyed this lesson as much as what I've enjoyed presenting it to you. I'm very excited to do a few more science lessons for you. Please remember, if you have any questions whatsoever, please email grade6@worksheetcloud.com. Any questions at all about this lesson, grade6@worksheetcloud.com. This lesson was brought to you by Worksheet Cloud. And grade sixes, I just want to say that I know that it is tough staying indoors, but I'm very proud of you. You are learning. You are still educating yourselves through watching these videos and doing the activities. And so you should be very proud of yourself. So one thing that I always end of all my lessons with is my favorite saying in the whole world. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it, but I always say Hakuna Matata. And you all know it comes from The Lion King, but the reason why it's my favorite is that my surname, Kun, is actually in Hakuna Matata. I know it's lame, but I love it. So it means no worries, grade sixes. So no worries. Hakuna Matata. Be kind to one another, and I'll see you soon. Bye.